Now, whilst it's nice that we have this overlay here, it's not that nice that we can't get rid of it. I can type something here, and you see that it gets updated in the background, but of course, it would be great if we could close this modal somehow. For example, by clicking on that backdrop, on that transparent black background. So how could we achieve this behavior? Well, in the end, again, with help of state. You could say one state should be that the modal is visible, and another state should be that it's not visible. And then, for example, by clicking on that background, we want to update the state and switch it from is visible to is not visible. And then we want to display this entire modal conditionally based on that state. So it's in the end a three-step process. Register a new state, add an event listener to this backdrop, and then use that state to show or not show this modal. So to implement this, I'm back here in posts list JSX, and I'll zoom out a bit since the code keeps on growing. And there we now don't just want to manage these two values that can be submitted or entered through that form, but I instead now also want to add an additional state slice here with use state. And the position does not matter if it's the first, the second, or the last state. This does not matter. But here the default value should, for example, be true, because here I won't manage some text as a state value, but instead the modal is visible state. The name is up to you, but you should try to describe what's controlled by that state. And here I want to control the modal visibility. So I'll name it modal is visible, and the updating function could be called set modal is visible. And by default here it's true, so that we start with the modal being visible. Of course, this alone doesn't do much. We now also need to add some code to change this if we click on this background here. Now to achieve this, we can go to the modal component, because here we got that background. It's this div here. And there we can add the onClick event listener. Click is another default event, and onClick is therefore a prop we can add to set up a listener to the click event on that div. And the function that should be executed should now not be defined here in this modal, but again in posts list. So again, we're lifting the state up. Here we can add a new function, show modal handler, for example, or in our case actually the hide modal handler, because that's what we want to do if the backdrop is clicked. And here we can call set modal is visible and set it to false as a new state value. Now we have to pass this function as a value to the modal component here. So here we could add a prop called onClose. It's your component, so the prop name is up to you. And pass the hide modal handler as a value to onClose. Again, without parentheses, passing the function itself as a value rather than the return value of that function, which is what we would pass if we would have parentheses here. So we pass the function itself. And since I named the prop onClose here, in the modal component, we can now also destructure this onClose prop here and set it as a value to onClick, so that this function which we receive on the onClose prop is set as a value for the onClick prop, hence wiring this click listener up to this hide modal handler function in the end. Now with that we have a way of updating the state, but right now we still wouldn't see any effect on the screen because we're not doing anything with that modal is visible state. We're updating it, but we're not using it thereafter. And that's the last step. Now we want to render this modal conditionally based on our state. So the goal is to only render this piece of code here, this JSX code, if modal is visible is true. Now how can we achieve this? Again with a dynamic value, so with single curly braces. But now we don't just want to output modal is visible, we don't just want to output true or false, but instead we want to control what's being shown on the screen. We could achieve this with a ternary expression. If that's true, and for that we can also just check modal is visible, we want to output this content. And indeed you can cut and paste that content here after the question mark, and then add a colon here, since I'm writing a ternary expression, where we also define what should be rendered if this is false. And that could be null. Null is something you can output as part of your JSX code, and it will simply lead to nothing being rendered here. Alternatively, you could also set this to false, and this would also render nothing. If I now save this, you see by default this is open, which should make sense because our default state value is true for modal is visible. But if I click on this backdrop, it disappears. And it disappears because I set the state to false. That's what we do here. And thanks to this ternary expression, it's then this else case that becomes active. And if you output false or null here, nothing gets displayed on the screen in this place in your JSX code. The other parts, like this list, are still being output, but this content, to be precise, is now rendered conditionally with help of that ternary expression. Now there are other approaches as well. We could, for example, add a variable, modal content, and by default set that to nothing, so to undefined, and then check if modal is visible is true, and in that case set modal content to this JSX code. You can store JSX code in variables as well. You can not just return it in functions. You can use it anywhere where a value is wanted. And then down here in the JSX code we do return, we could now just refer to modal content. And this would now either be nothing, undefined, which also leads to nothing being output on the screen, or it's this content. Now we are using a variable here, but we'll see the updated content nonetheless because we are using a state value, which is updated with our state updating function here in the posts list component. So this variable will only receive a new value if the state was updated with that state updating function, and therefore this component function was executed again. Hence we'll see the updated JSX snapshot being reflected on the screen. So with that code, if I reload the page, it will still close if I click on the backdrop. And one last alternative which I want to show you, though this here is a great approach since it's also quite readable, is that you go back here in your JSX code, and instead of writing a ternary expression, you use the modal is visible state value again, and then the logical AND operator here, to then define the content that should be output if modal is visible is truthy, so if it's true in this case. Due to the way JavaScript works, it will now output this content only if this value here is truthy, if it's true, and otherwise it will output nothing. Or to be precise, it will output the falsy value, false in this case, and that, as you learned, will lead to nothing showing up on the screen. So here we're using standard JavaScript to render nothing or the modal. So that's another approach of making sure that we can hide it. And no matter which approach you prefer, all three approaches are fine, but that's how you can render content conditionally.